today, wow, we're diving deep into the ancient history of Iranian music. It's quite a journey back.
It really is. We've got some great sources here, academic papers on, the music itself, but also the Indo-Iranian peoples, bits on prehistoric art, even Mithraism.
Right, a real mix. And our mission really is to try and uncover those very early foundations of Iranian music. Look at how it connects to the culture, the religion, those big historical shifts in the region.
Okay, so where do we even begin? The origins seem incredibly ancient.
They absolutely are. The sources point straight away to this deep connection with the ancient Aryan tribes, their beliefs, their culture. It all ties back. We're talking Proto-Indo-European times, potentially.
And these Aryan tribes, they started moving on to the Iranian plateau around, 3000 BC?
Yes.
That's a long time ago.
A very long time. And it's interesting, the sources mention they called themselves Arya, or Aryans. It's a term scholars still use, along with Indo-Iranian.
Right, associated with cultures like Sintashta and Andronovo up on the Eurasian steppe originally.
Exactly. And that migration led eventually to the split, the Indian and Iranian groups going their separate ways. One theory suggests it wasn't just geography.
The differing views on the gods.
Precisely. Different ideas about deity worship might have been a key factor in that divergence, which is fascinating to think about. And their whole worldview is different.
How so?
Well, the sources emphasize this belief in a really strong connection between, the earthly world and the celestial, the divine realm.
Okay, so not just separate spheres, but interconnected.
Yes. And this wasn't just a philosophical idea. It directly influenced their art, their music. It was a way to express devotion.
And maybe maintain some kind of cosmic balance, like the music helped keep things in harmony.
That seems to be the idea, a way to connect, to resonate between earth and the heavens. It's a powerful concept.
It really is. Now, obviously, finding actual musical scores from, 3000 BC is unlikely.
Yeah, probably not. But we do have other ways to get glimpses. The Shahnameh, for instance.
Ferdowsi's epic.
Yeah.
Written much, much later, 10th century CE. But it draws on older traditions, right?
Exactly. It's this incredible blend of history, legend, myth. It gives us a unique window, even if it's not a purely factual account in the modern sense.
So what does the Shahnameh tell us about music in that sort of mythical Pishtadian era with kinky umars and all that?
It actually lists specific instruments, which is pretty amazing. Instruments used in battle, like the boo, kind of horn maybe, to signal danger.
Okay, so practical uses.
And recreational ones, too. Things like the aniye, pail, some kind of percussion, the jaras, maybe a bell, also the chelb, the shindaf, the table, that's a drum, and the ney, a flute.
So quite a variety. Even in these legendary accounts, it suggests music was pretty integrated into life.
Absolutely. And the Shahnameh really hammers home that link. Culture, religion, cosmology, it's all tangled together. Mithraism is a perfect example of this.
Right, Mithraism pops up in the sources too. Its roots are deep in that ancient Iranian culture.
Deep roots. Mithra, often shown as a seven-pointed star. The whole system involved secrets, initiation, enduring hardships.
And there are parallels there, aren't there? Between the Shahnameh's Pishtadian era and Mithraism, both seem to emphasize that spiritual connection, seeking wisdom, finding harmony between the earthly and the divine.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like these core ideas were fundamental to how they understood the world and expressed it, including through music and art.
It's pretty wild how Mithraism even traveled west. It became popular with the Roman army for centuries.
It is, though, scholars debate how much continuity there was between the Persian origins and the Roman version. But the inspiration seems clearly Iranian. Shows how ideas travel.
Definitely. And speaking of religious context, we should mention the Vedas.
Good point. Some of the oldest Aryan texts we have. The Rig Veda, for example, has hymns to gods like Indra, Mithra, Varuna, deities worshipped before Zoroastrianism really took hold.
And then Zoroastrianism arrives with its distinct dualism, good versus evil.
Right, Ahura Mazda versus Angra Mainyu. And the sources suggest this might even be reflected symbolically in instruments like the dutar, with its two strings, a representation of duality.
Could be. And fire, of course, becomes such a central, sacred symbol in Zoroastrian art. Again, showing how belief shapes artistic expression.
So we have these textual and religious clues, but what about actual physical evidence? Archaeology?
Well, it gets tricky that far back. The findings from Bagaskoy around the 14th century BC are interesting. Apparently early on there wasn't this strong sense of conflict among the gods.
But later in Iran, Angramanyu or Ahriman really solidifies as this figure of evil.
Exactly. And the Shahnameh kind of echoes that conflict, telling stories of the Iranian Aryans battling the native Divs for control of the plateau.
Then there's that incredible Babylonian inscription from the 9th century BC.
Ah, yes. Interpreted as possibly the earliest musical notation we know of.
For a 22-stringed harp, according to Galpin's interpretation. I mean, imagine. That points to a fairly sophisticated musical understanding quite early on.
It really does. And then there's the Chagamish seal from Khuzestan.
The earliest picture of an orchestra? Potentially?
It certainly looks like it. A group of musicians playing together. It visually reinforces how important music must have been.
And the sources mention this idea that in ancient Aryan culture, music and speech were closely linked, based on ideas of balance and harmony in expression. Not just noise, but meaningful sound.
Absolutely. And we have to remember, instrument making itself goes back incredibly far. Paleolithic flutes found in Europe.
Like the Divjay Babe flute, tens of thousands of years old.
Right, or the Holfels flute and those Jiahu bone flutes from China around 7000 BCE. That could actually play scales. Humans have been making music for a very, very long time.
So focusing back on Iran specifically, the Elamite civilization comes up. Our sources mention musical practices in Susa, early 3rd millennium BC, instruments in religious ceremonies.
Yeah, there's that clay artifact showing musicians playing while transporting statues of gods to the temple, a really vivid image.
And harps seem important in Elam. These standing or horizontal harps, sometimes called the Iranian harp, finds in Nahavand, Malayer, even showing up in Egypt.
Suggests some kind of cultural connection or spread of musical technology, perhaps. And that Susa relief from the 8th century BC.
The one showing a musician playing something like a tambour, a long-necked lute, more evidence for specific instruments.
Definitely. Plus, actual instruments found at places like Tepe Hisar and Astrabad, small gold horns, hourglass-shaped drums dating back to around 1700 BC, tangible pieces of their musical world.
It's fascinating, and one of the sources cites the musicologist Farmer, who believed Elamite musicians were performing at temple gates way back in the 27th century BC, during King Inshushnak's reign.
He even suggested some Assyrian influence, right? Pointing to shared words like tabira for drum or karneh for a horn or trumpet, language clues.
Yeah, suggesting musical exchange even then. Now, the median period, that's a bit of a gap, isn't it? 708 to 550 BC.
It is, unfortunately. The sources are pretty upfront about the lack of substantial musical documentation from the Medes themselves. We know music was likely important, especially for the nobility.
Because Syrian and Greek sources mention it.
Right, but direct Median evidence, like instruments or notation, it's scarce.
But we do know they continued performing certain rituals, like akiyas, sacrifice rituals.
Yes, and given that similar Avestan rituals definitely involved chanting, singing, it seems likely the Median versions did too. Music was probably part of it, even if we don't have the details.
It seems a safe assumption. And the sources also circle back to mention things like that wind instrument found at 7 Tepe from the 2nd millennium BC.
And the tanbur player depiction from Susa, around 1500 BC. It all reinforces this long, continuous thread of music making in the region, even with gaps in our knowledge for specific periods like the Median.
So wrapping this up, it's just incredibly clear how deep and complex the history of Iranian music is. It's not just one thing. It's woven through migrations, beliefs, art.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You see it tied to the early Aryan tribes, then shaped by Mithraism, Zoroastrianism, reflected in epics like the Shahnameh. It's intrinsically linked to their spiritual lives.
That connection between music and religious or spiritual impulse seems central throughout, expressing devotion, connecting with the cosmos. It's a constant theme.
And the archaeology, even if sometimes sparse, gives us these tantalizing glimpses. The harps, the horns, the drums, those depictions of musicians. It makes it tangible.
It really does. It highlights that fundamental human need to use sound, music, art, to reach for something beyond the everyday, to connect with the spiritual.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe for you listening.
Yeah.
Given how incredibly long and deep these Iranian musical roots are, how might those ancient echoes still be present today?
In ways we might not even consciously recognize, resonating subtly in the diverse music we hear from the region now.
Exactly. Something to ponder. How much of that ancient past still vibrates in the present?